The call came at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been sitting in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours straight, still wearing the same flour-dusted jeans I'd had on when I was harvesting the last of the sweet corn that afternoon. My phone was face up on my knee, and I'd been staring at it so long that the screen had gone dark 3 times. I wasn't waiting for a call from Turkey. I wasn't thinking about Linda at all. I was watching the door to the pediatric ICU and praying that my 8-year-old son Mason would make it through the night. Then the screen lit up. International number. A code I didn't recognize at first. +90. Turkey. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like the floor had opened up beneath me. Because in that single, freezing second, everything connected. The missing $15,000. The harvested fields that should have been full. The smirk on Linda's face 3 days earlier when she'd looked me dead in the eyes and said, "That kid's not going to make it anyway." And now this call from a country she had no business being in on a night when her grandson was fighting for his life 200 feet away from where I was sitting. I turned pale. I mean genuinely, physically pale. The nurse at the station across the hall actually looked up at me with concern. I let it ring 4 times. 5. My thumb hovered over the green button. And then I made a decision that changed everything. But to understand why I answered the way I did, or honestly, why I hesitated at all, you have to understand who Linda Marsh was, who I was, and how a woman could look at a sick child and say something like that without flinching. You have to go back about 3 years, to a little corner of central Ohio where I thought I had finally built something worth keeping. My name is Ashley Calloway, though I kept my married name, Marsh, for Mason's sake. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Columbus, moved to a small town called Grover Falls when I was 26, for a man I loved and a piece of land I came to love even more. The town has maybe 4,000 people, 1 stoplight, a Dairy Queen that closes at 8, and the kind of neighbors who bring casseroles when something goes wrong. Before everything fell apart, I genuinely thought I'd won the lottery of life. Not the money lottery. Lord knows we were never rolling in it. But the kind of lottery where you wake up in the morning and feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. My husband, Derek Marsh, was a good man. I want to say that clearly because this story is not about him. Derek worked maintenance for the county. Steady paycheck, good benefits, home by 5:30 most nights. He coached Mason's Little League team for 2 seasons, and he cried at the end of Toy Story 3 every single time, which I always thought was the most honest thing about him. We weren't perfect. We argued about money sometimes, about how much time he spent helping his mother with things she was perfectly capable of doing herself. But we were solid. We were a team. Mason came along in 2016, and honestly, he rearranged everything in the best possible way. He had Derek's dark eyes and my stubbornness, and from the time he could walk, he wanted to be outside in the dirt, following me around the vegetable beds, asking questions about why tomatoes turn red and whether earthworms have feelings. I started the garden as a hobby, and it turned into something more over about 3 years. We had 2 acres behind the house. Not much by farm standards, but enough. Sweet corn, tomatoes, zucchini, butternut squash, green beans. I'd started selling at the Grover Falls Farmers Market on Saturday mornings, and by the summer before everything happened, I was clearing somewhere between $800 and $1,200 a month from the crops alone. Not life-changing, but real, meaningful, mine. We rented the house from a local landlord, Mr. Patterson, who was so easygoing he sometimes forgot to cash our checks for 6 weeks. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch on Crescent Drive. White siding, blue shutters, a porch that sagged a little on the left side but held just fine. Mason had the back bedroom, with the window that looked out over the garden. In the mornings, I'd sometimes hear him up before me, nose pressed against the glass, watching the rows like he was waiting for something to happen. That was the world. That was the life. And then there was Linda. Linda Marsh was Derek's mother. And I want to be fair here, because I spent a long time trying to be fair. She was 61 when all this started, a retired school administrator who had lived alone since Derek's father passed away in 2018. She lived about 20 minutes from us, in a newer subdivision in Millfield. Millfield, nicer neighborhood than ours. HOA and everything. Little brick colonial with a 2-car garage she only used for storage. She was sharp, well-dressed, the kind of woman who always had her nails done and her hair colored, and who noticed immediately if you'd gained any weight since she last saw you. The thing about Linda was that she had 2 modes. With Derek, she was warm, almost soft. His mother in every traditional sense, saving him the biggest piece of anything, calling just to hear his voice. With me, she was correct, polite, technically without fault. The kind of woman who says all the right things at Thanksgiving dinner, while making sure you understand, through some frequency only women can hear, that she has never fully accepted you. She called Mason Derek's boy a lot. Not my grandson or Mason, Derek's boy. I noticed it from the beginning. Derek said I was reading into things. Maybe I was. I wanted to be wrong about her. She just needs time, Derek used to say, whenever I'd come home from a family dinner with that specific tension behind my eyes. She's protective. She lost my dad. Give her room. I gave her room. I gave her 4 years of room. And then Mason got sick. It started in January of last year. He was 7, almost 8. He'd been tired more than usual, and I'd chalked it up to the dark Ohio winter, the way the cold just settles into kids and slows them down. But the tiredness didn't lift. By February, he had bruises on his legs that neither of us could explain. By March, we were at Columbus Children's Hospital getting blood work done, and the doctor, Dr. Reyes, who had the gentlest voice I've ever heard on a person delivering terrible news, explained that Mason had a condition called aplastic anemia. His bone marrow wasn't producing enough blood cells. Without treatment, it would get worse. With the right treatment, specifically a bone marrow transplant, there was a strong chance he could recover fully. Strong chance. Those 2 words became my whole life. The transplant process was expensive in ways I hadn't fully prepared for, even after reading every website I could find. Our insurance covered the bulk of the procedure itself, but the ancillary costs, the pre-treatment medications, the specialized follow-up care, the anti-rejection drugs that Mason would need for months afterward, The travel costs for consultations in Columbus, the time Derek and I both lost from work, added up faster than I could track. By April, we had burned through our $4,000 emergency fund completely. Derek picked up weekend shifts. I started selling at a second farmer's market in the next town over on Wednesdays. And I started planning the harvest like it was a military operation. That spring, I put in more than I ever had. Sweet corn across the full back 2 acres, plus a side plot of tomatoes and butternut squash along the fence line. I bought better seed. I woke up at 5:30 every morning to water and check and tend. Mason, even when he was tired, would sit on the back steps, wrapped in a blanket, and watch me work. And sometimes I'd look back at him and think, this is for you. Every single row of this is for you. By July, I had estimates from the farmer's market coordinator about what the full corn harvest alone would bring in. Between that and the squash and the late tomatoes, I was looking at somewhere between $14,000 and $17,000 by September, enough to cover the remaining out-of-pocket costs for Mason's transplant and leave us a small cushion for the recovery months. I told Derek. I told Mason. I even told Linda one Sunday afternoon when she came for dinner and was being unusually pleasant, complimenting the garden, asking about Mason's treatment timeline. She stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the rows, and nodded slowly. "That's a lot of corn," she said. "It's everything we need," I told her. "We're going to be okay." She turned from the window and smiled at me. And I remember thinking, finally she sees it. Finally she understands what I've been building out there. I didn't know she was already calculating something. I didn't know that smile meant anything other than what it looked like. And I didn't know that 3 weeks later, I would walk out to the back fields on a Tuesday morning to find them stripped clean. Every ear of corn gone, the stalks bare and broken, the ground marked with tire tracks from a truck I didn't recognize, and that the $15,000 meant to save my son's life would have vanished as completely as if it had never existed at all. But that morning, standing at the kitchen window with Linda, I just handed her a cup of coffee and felt something close to hope. That was the last time I trusted her. I just didn't know it yet. I found out on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my early market days. The Wednesday farmers market in Hendricks County started with a setup at 6 a.m., and the night before, I always did a walkthrough of the fields to plan what I was pulling in the morning. I had my harvesting gloves on, I had my headlamp, I had a big thermos of coffee because the September nights in central Ohio get cold fast, and I was in a decent mood because Mason had had a good day. He'd eaten most of his dinner and asked to watch a movie and fallen asleep on the couch with his head on my lap, which hadn't happened in weeks. I walked out the back door at about 9:15 p.m. and turned toward the corn rows. And then I stopped. The headlamp swept across 2 full acres of nothing. Stripped stalks, broken stems bent sideways at the base. The ground churned up in long parallel lines, tire tracks from something wide, something heavy. A truck or maybe a small flatbed. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing because they hadn't damaged the plants randomly the way vandals would. They'd moved row by row, methodical, efficient, like a harvest. Because it was a harvest, just not mine. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. My brain kept refusing to process it. I walked to the first row and crouched down and touched a broken stalk, and the corn silk was still slightly sticky, which meant it hadn't been long, a few hours at most. Then I walked to the fence line where the squash and the late tomatoes were planted, and those rows had been hit too. Not completely stripped, but probably 60% of what I had left. The butternut squash that I'd been watching all summer, the ones I'd staked and watered through the August heat, gone. Crates of them, loaded up and hauled away. I sat down in the dirt between the rows. Just sat down, right there in my jeans and gloves and headlamp, and I did something I hadn't done since Mason's diagnosis. I cried. Not quietly either. The ugly kind of crying where your whole body gets involved and you can't breathe right, and you don't even try to hold it back because there's no one to hold it back for. $14,000 minimum. Gone. I called Derek from the field. He answered on the second ring. He'd been up watching TV, and I could hear the game in the background. Someone took the crops, I said. Derek, someone came in here with a truck and took everything. There was a pause. What do you mean, took everything? I mean, the corn is gone, the squash is gone, the tomatoes are half gone, there are tire tracks, someone harvested my fields and took all of it. Another pause, longer. Ashley, are you sure you're not... Derek! My voice came out flat and hard. Come outside and look. He came. He stood next to me with his phone flashlight on and swept it across the stripped rows, and I watched his face go through the same stages mine had. Confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like dread. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Who would do this? He finally said. I don't know. And I didn't. Not yet. But we need to call the sheriff. We filed a report that night. Deputy Crawford came out, walked the perimeter, took photos of the tire tracks, and told us he'd make some inquiries. He was sympathetic but realistic. Without witnesses or a plate number, tracking down stolen produce was, as he put it, not the easiest thing in the world. We weren't in a neighborhood with cameras. Mr. Patterson, our landlord, had a motion sensor light on the back of the barn, but it hadn't triggered, which meant whoever did this had approached from the east fence line, not through the main property entrance. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad and tried to reconstruct exactly what we had left. The savings account, Derek's overtime, what the partial tomato harvest might still bring in. And the numbers didn't work. They didn't come close to working. We were looking at somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000 short of what we needed for Mason's post-transplant medications and follow-up care. Derek sat across from me and watched me do the math and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. The next morning, I called Dr. Reyes' office and asked to speak with the financial coordinator. Her name was Patricia, and she was kind but direct. We had a window for Mason's transplant procedure, and if we couldn't demonstrate coverage for the follow-up care costs within the next 3 weeks, the timeline would have to be pushed. Pushing the timeline was not, she explained gently, without risk given where Mason's counts currently were. I hung up and went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and breathed. Then I got up and went back to work. I spent 2 days making calls. The farmers market coordinator, a few of the regular vendors I'd become friendly with, the agricultural extension office over in Millfield. I was trying to figure out if anyone had seen a truck, if any of the other small farms in the area had reported anything similar, if there was a pattern. The extension office gave me the number of a produce broker named Gary Fenton, who sometimes bought in bulk from local growers, and I called him on a Thursday afternoon, mostly just to ask if he'd heard anything. Gary Fenton picked up on the third ring, and what he said next made the room tilt. "Ashley Marsh?" he said. "Yeah, actually. I bought a pretty significant load of sweet corn and squash from a woman who said she was managing the Crescent Drive property. Linda, I think her name was. Last Tuesday evening. She had the paperwork." The room went completely still. "She had what paperwork?" I said. "A bill of sale. Handwritten, but it had the property address and a signature. She said the landowner had authorized the harvest. I paid cash. $14,200. He paused. "Is there a problem?" I couldn't speak for a moment. My hand was shaking so badly I had to press the phone against my shoulder to keep from dropping it. "Gary," I said very carefully, "can I ask where you sent that payment?" He told me it had gone directly to Linda, cash in hand, right there at the roadside. She'd had a truck, a rented flatbed, he thought, though he hadn't paid attention to the plates. She'd been efficient, friendly, and completely convincing. I thanked him and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes before I did anything else. Then I got in my car and I drove to Millfield. Linda's brick colonial looked exactly as it always did. Pristine, a little smug, the kind of house that looked like it was judging you from the driveway. Her car was there. The lights were on in the front room. I rang the doorbell and waited, and when she opened the door, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not surprise, not guilt, but something almost like relief. Like she'd been waiting for this. "Ashley," she said pleasantly, "I wasn't expecting you." "I talked to Gary Fenton today," I said. Not a flicker, not even a blink. "Come in," she said, and stepped aside. I came in. I stood in her front hallway with its framed family photos and its little table with the decorative bowl full of keys and mail, and I looked at her and said, "You sold my crops. You took $14,000 that was supposed to pay for Mason's transplant care. I need you to give me that money." Linda sat down in the armchair by the window, her chair, the one she always sat in, and folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "That garden is on a property I co-signed on years ago. I spoke with Mr. Patterson directly. I had every legal right." The air went out of me. "You spoke with Mr. Patterson." "I explained that there was a dispute about the harvest rights. He was amenable." She tilted her head slightly. "You should have put things in writing, Ashley. You've always been careless that way." I wanted to scream. I wanted to knock that bowl of keys off the table and keep going until the whole room was broken. Instead, I said, very quietly, "Linda, that money is for your grandson. Mason needs those medications. He needs the follow-up care. Without it, the transplant timeline gets pushed, and his counts are..." "Mason is very sick," she said. Her voice was level, measured, like she was discussing a weather forecast. "I understand that. But I also understand that Derek has been running himself into the ground for 2 years, and that this family has been organized entirely around your little farm project and whether it's going to save the day." She looked at me with something I can only describe as pity. "I'm his mother. I've been watching this for 2 years. And honestly, Ashley, that kid's not going to make it anyway. The world stopped. I heard those words. I heard them clearly in her voice, with that particular flatness she delivered them in. And something inside me went very, very quiet. Not the quiet of shock. The quiet of a decision being made so deep inside you that it doesn't make any noise on the way out. I'm going to ask you one more time, I said. Give me the money. I don't have it anymore, Linda said. And then she smiled. I've already made some plans. I drove home with my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white the entire 20 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't call Derek from the car. I walked inside and found him at the kitchen table, and I told him exactly what Linda had said. All of it, including the last part, the part about Mason. And I watched his face go through something I'd never seen on Derek Marsh before. He went gray. Actually, genuinely gray. She said, "What?" he said. Not a question. She said he's not going to make it anyway, I repeated. And she said she's already spent the money. Derek stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He grabbed his phone and called her. I heard it ring through. 4 times. 5 times. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. The 3rd time she picked up, and I could hear his voice go low and controlled in a way that scared me a little, because Derek Marsh did not do low and controlled. Derek did warm and even-tempered and slightly too patient. This was something else. I couldn't hear Linda's side of the conversation, but I could hear Derek's. No, that's not... Mom, that's Mason's money. That's his surgery money. And then, after a long pause, where did you spend it? Tell me where you spent it. Another pause. What do you mean a trip? What trip? He looked at me across the kitchen, phone still at his ear, and his face said everything. Turkey. She was going to Turkey. 2 weeks, she'd apparently told him. A tour she'd booked with a friend from her HOA. Istanbul, the coast, the whole thing. She'd put a deposit down months ago and used the rest of the harvest money to pay it off in full. Derek hung up the phone and set it on the counter. He stood there with his hands flat on the kitchen surface and his head down, and I thought he was going to say something. Some version of, "I'm sorry," or "I'll fix this," or "I'll make her give it back." Instead, what he said was, "She thinks she can pay it back in installments after she gets home." Installments. After she gets home from the trip to Turkey. While my son's transplant timeline was collapsing. While his blood counts were trending the wrong direction. While I had 3 weeks to demonstrate coverage to Patricia at Dr. Reyes's office or risk losing the window entirely. I looked at my husband. My good, steady, warm-eyed husband who cried at Toy Story 3 and coached Little League and had never once in 6 years of marriage given me a reason not to trust him. "Derek," I said, "I need you to tell me right now that you are going to fix this. Not installments, not after she gets home. Now." He looked up. And the thing that broke something inside me, the thing I didn't see coming, the thing that was worse in some ways than Linda's smirk, was that his eyes were full of an emotion I recognized immediately. It wasn't anger at his mother. It wasn't resolve. It wasn't the face of a man about to go to war for his son. It was guilt. Old, deep, pre-existing guilt. The kind that meant he already knew something. "Derek," I said again, softer this time. What do you know that you haven't told me? He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the counter. She asked me about the harvest timeline, he said. Back in July. She asked me how much you were expecting to make and when it would come in. I thought she was just... He stopped. I thought she was being supportive. I thought she was finally taking an interest. The kitchen was very quiet. You told her, I said. You told her exactly what we were expecting and when the corn would be ready. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. And that was when I understood that the betrayal wasn't just Linda's, that it had two layers, and the second one went all the way to the center of everything I thought I'd built. Mason coughed from the back bedroom, a wet, tired sound that carried through the whole house. I stood up from the table, walked to the back bedroom, and sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing evened out again. I looked at his face in the dark, Derek's dark eyes, my stubbornness, and I made myself a promise so quietly that it didn't even feel like words. I was going to get that money back. Every cent. Whatever it took. However long it took. And I was going to start in the morning. What I didn't know yet was that Linda had already booked her flight, that she was leaving in 4 days. And that once she landed in Istanbul, getting anything back through any normal channel, a phone call, a family conversation, a reasonable agreement between adults, was going to become essentially impossible. I also didn't know that I wasn't the only person Linda had been talking to about Mason's prognosis. But I was about to find out. The morning after Derek told me what he'd done, after I sat on Mason's bed in the dark and made that silent promise to myself, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. and couldn't go back to sleep. I lay there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling above our bed, listening to Derek breathe next to me, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. A cold, clarifying kind of fury. Not the hot, gasping kind that makes you do stupid things. The other kind. The kind that settles into your chest like ballast and makes you very, very still. I got up without waking him, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with my legal pad and wrote down everything I knew in 2 columns. What Linda had done, what Derek had done. And underneath both columns, one question. What can actually be proven? The Gary Fenton conversation was the most important thing I had. He'd bought the crops directly from Linda, paid her cash, $14,200. He had her name. He remembered the transaction clearly. What he'd also mentioned, and I'd almost missed it in my shock, was the bill of sale she'd presented. Handwritten, he'd said. Property address, a signature. She'd told him the landowner had authorized the harvest. Mr. Patterson, our landlord, the easygoing man who sometimes forgot to cash our checks for 6 weeks. I called him at 8 a.m. He picked up on the 4th ring, sounding like he'd just woken up. Mr. Patterson, I said, this is Ashley Marsh, over at Crescent Drive. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course, he said, cautious now. Did you authorize Linda Marsh to harvest the crops from the back fields? Did you sign anything? Did you speak with her about the produce or give her any kind of permission? A pause. A long one. Ashley, he said slowly. Linda Marsh called me about 3 weeks ago. She told me there was a family situation and that you and Derek had agreed she should handle the harvest sale that year because you were dealing with Mason being sick. She said you'd asked her to take care of it. Another pause. She sounded very reasonable. I didn't think to question it. I'm real sorry, honey. I didn't know. My hand tightened on the phone. Did you sign anything? No, we just talked on the phone. I said it sounded fine. I didn't put anything in writing. Which meant the bill of sale Linda had shown Gary Fenton, the one she'd claimed authorized the harvest, was either completely fabricated or had Mr. Patterson's name on it without his knowledge. Either way, it was fraud. It wasn't a family dispute over harvest rights. It wasn't Linda exercising some legal claim on a property she'd co-signed on years ago. It was fraud. She'd lied to Mr. Patterson to manufacture permission she didn't have, created a fraudulent document, and sold property that wasn't hers. Mr. Patterson, I said, I need you to write down what you just told me. Exactly what she said. Exactly what you said. Date and time of the call if you can find it. Can you do that for me? I can do that, he said quietly. Ashley, I am so sorry. I didn't know about Mason. I didn't know any of it. I know you didn't, I said. I'll be in touch. I hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then I wrote 2 words on my legal pad, circled them twice, and underlined them. Criminal fraud. I spent the rest of that morning on the phone with the Grover County Sheriff's Office, asking to add information to the report Deputy Crawford had filed 2 nights earlier. I explained what I'd learned from Gary Fenton and Mr. Patterson. The woman I spoke with, a dispatcher named Carol, told me I needed to come in and speak with a detective, not just add to the existing report. She gave me an appointment for 2 p.m. I also called Patricia at Dr. Reyes's office. I explained the situation, not all of it, just the financial part, and asked if there was any way to extend our coverage demonstration window by even a week. Patricia was sympathetic, genuinely so, but firm. The transplant team had a schedule. Mason's counts were the counts they were, and the window was the window. She could give me 10 days. Not 3 weeks, 10 days. 10 days to come up with $12,000 to $15,000, or prove that it was coming. I went to the 2 p.m. appointment at the sheriff's office alone. Derek had offered to come, and I'd said no. Not because I was punishing him, or not only because of that, but because I needed to think clearly, and Derek's presence had started to feel like a variable I couldn't control. His guilt made him unpredictable. His loyalty to Linda, even now, was a fracture I could feel but couldn't measure. The detective was a man named Holt, mid-50s, gray mustache, the kind of unhurried manner that either means someone is very good at their job or very close to retirement. He listened to everything I said without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. "The bill of sale she presented to the buyer," he said. "You believe it was forged?" "I believe Mr. Patterson never signed anything," I said. "He told me himself he only spoke with her on the phone. He didn't authorize a written document." "And the buyer paid cash, $14,200. "Yes." Detective Holt tapped his pen against the notepad. "Ms. Marsh, I want to be straight with you. If everything you're telling me checks out, and I have no reason to think it doesn't, what you're describing is criminal theft by deception, potentially aggravated by the fraudulent document. That's a felony in Ohio. But, he paused, your mother-in-law is leaving the country in 4 days. I know. Once she's in Turkey, we have no jurisdiction. We can issue a warrant, but extradition for property crimes between the U.S. and Turkey it's complicated and slow. He looked at me steadily. If we're going to do anything before she leaves, we need to move fast. And fast means you need to give me everything you have today. Gary Fenton's contact information, Mr. Patterson's statement, any text messages or calls between you and Linda about the harvest money, any proof she acknowledged what she did. I thought about the conversation in her living room, her folded hands, her voice telling me she didn't have the money anymore. The smile. She said it to my face, I told him. She admitted she sold the crops and spent the money on a trip to Turkey. Witnesses? No, just me. He nodded slowly. That's harder. Your word against hers. But Fenton and Patterson together? That's something. I'm going to reach out to both of them today. I want you to go home and put together anything written or digital you have. Text messages especially. I drove home with my heart hammering and my brain running at twice its normal speed. I went through my phone, every text thread with Linda going back 2 years. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect from a difficult mother-in-law. Surface-level pleasantries, occasional passive-aggressive comments about Mason's diet or my schedule, the occasional pointed remark about how Derek used to spend his Sundays before he married me. Nothing about the harvest. Nothing incriminating. Until I scrolled back to a thread from July, one I'd almost forgotten about, where Linda had texted me asking when the corn would be at peak. I'd answered without thinking because at the time it seemed like a completely innocent question from a grandmother trying to understand what was happening in her grandson's life. Peak harvest probably last week of August, first week of September, I'd written. Gary at the market says September corn brings the best price. We're on track. And Linda had replied, good to know. That was it. 3 words. But it established, in writing, that she'd asked about the harvest timeline before it happened, which, combined with Fenton and Patterson, painted a picture that was harder to dismiss as a misunderstanding. I forwarded the screenshot to Detective Holt with a short note and sat back in my chair. It was at that point, right at that moment, sitting in my kitchen with my phone on the table and the afternoon light coming in sideways through the window over the sink, that I heard Mason coughing again from the back bedroom. Not the wet, exhausted cough from the night before. Something sharper, more urgent. I was down the hallway in 4 steps. He was sitting up in bed, and his face was the color of old paper. Not pale the way kids get when they're tired, but genuinely, frighteningly pale, with a gray undertone that I had learned, over the past 8 months, to take seriously. His lips looked slightly blue at the edges. Mason, I said, very carefully, sitting on the edge of his bed and putting my hand on his forehead. He was burning. Hey, look at me. He looked at me. His dark eyes were glassy. My chest hurts, he said. When I breathe in. I called Derek, and then I called Dr. Reyes's after-hours line simultaneously, which is a thing I had apparently learned to do. And 20 minutes later, we were in the car heading to Columbus Children's Hospital. Mason wrapped in his yellow blanket in the back seat. Derek driving 90 miles an hour in a 65 zone, while I sat in back with Mason's head in my lap and talked to him steadily about nothing. About the garden, about earthworms, about whether the corn in other people's gardens had feelings. just to keep him awake and looking at me. They admitted him directly. Pneumonia on top of the aplastic anemia. Dr. Reyes met us in the hallway outside the pediatric ICU with her quiet voice and her careful face, and she explained that Mason's immune system was compromised enough that what would be a manageable respiratory infection in a healthy child had escalated quickly. He was stable, she said, but the timeline for the transplant, the window Patricia had extended to 10 days, was now a harder deadline than it had ever been. His body was fighting on multiple fronts. They needed to stabilize him and then move. "We need the coverage confirmed," she said, looking at me directly. "I know what's happening with the finances," Patricia told me. "Ashley, I need you to understand. We're not going to turn away a sick child. But the post-transplant medication protocol has to be funded. That's not optional. Without it, the transplant itself is—" She stopped, chose her words carefully. "It's significantly less effective." "I understand," I said. 10 days. "I understand," I said again. Derek was in the room with Mason. I was in the hallway alone with Dr. Reyes, and the particular fluorescent light of a hospital corridor at 7 in the evening, and I felt the bottom of everything drop out from under me all at once. The money was gone. Linda was leaving in 3 days. The detective was moving, but detectives didn't move at the speed of a child's failing immune system. My husband had given his mother the roadmap to destroy us, and still hadn't figured out whose side he was on. I had 10 days and no money and a sick boy 200 feet away, and for the first time since I'd stood in the stripped cornfields with my headlamp and my harvesting gloves, I genuinely did not know if I was going to be able to fix this. I walked to the waiting room and sat down. The chairs were that particular orange-beige color that waiting room chairs always are, as if hospitals ordered them from a catalog called Things That Suggest Neither Hope Nor Despair. I put my elbows on my knees and my face in my hands. I stayed like that for a while. I don't know how long exactly. And then someone sat down next to me. Not Derek, I could tell by the weight of the step, lighter, and by the faint smell of coffee and something floral. Ashley Marsh? I looked up. The woman sitting next to me was maybe 60, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of steady, direct gaze that belongs to people who have spent a lot of time in difficult rooms. She was wearing a lanyard with a hospital ID badge. Not a doctor. The badge said, Patient Advocate Jennifer Cole. "Patricia in Dr. Reyes's office mentioned you might be here tonight," she said. "She called me about an hour ago. She said the situation with your son's funding is—" She said it was complicated, and that there might be more to the story than a family financial shortfall. Jennifer Cole looked at me with that steady gaze. I work with families navigating funding crises, but I also have a background in victim services. And what Patricia described to me sounds like something I've dealt with before. I looked at her. "She said someone took the money," Jennifer said. "That it wasn't lost. That it was taken." "Yes," I said. "Tell me," she said simply. And I did. All of it. Gary Fenton, Mr. Patterson, Detective Holt, the bill of sale, the text messages, the conversation in Linda's living room, the smirk, the words she'd said about Mason, all of it in the orange-beige waiting room of Columbus Children's Hospital, while my son lay 200 feet away with pneumonia and a failing immune system and a 10-day clock running. Jennifer Cole listened to every word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, And then she opened the small notebook she'd been holding and wrote something down. "There's a crime victims' compensation fund in Ohio," she said. "It doesn't usually apply to property crimes, but when the victim is a minor and the stolen funds were specifically designated for medical care, there's case law. I've seen it applied." She looked up. "I'm also going to make 3 phone calls tonight. One to a prosecutor I know in the county DA's office who handles financial crimes. One to a nonprofit that provides emergency medical funding for transplant patients. And one to a journalist at the Columbus Dispatch who covers exactly this kind of story." I stared at her. "The journalist," I said. "Linda Marsh is leaving for Turkey in 3 days," Jennifer said. "The legal system can move, but it doesn't always move fast enough. Sometimes the fastest way to apply pressure is to make the situation visible." She met my eyes. "That's your call, but I want you to have the option." I sat back in my chair. The fluorescent light hummed above us. Down the hall, somewhere behind the ICU doors, my son was breathing with a chest that hurt when he inhaled, wrapped in his yellow blanket, waiting. "Make the calls," I said. Jennifer Cole nodded once, opened her phone, and started dialing. And in that moment, that specific moment in that specific waiting room, with the orange-beige chairs and the humming lights, and a woman I hadn't known existed 2 hours ago, already fighting for my son, something shifted. The cold, clarifying fury from that morning came back, but changed. It wasn't ballast anymore. It was something with direction. Something pointed directly at Linda Marsh and everything she thought she'd gotten away with. She was leaving in 3 days, but I was no longer just waiting for her to go. Jennifer Cole made those calls, all 3 of them. I know because by the next morning, my phone started ringing in ways it hadn't before. Not with condolences or questions or the careful tiptoeing language of people who didn't know what to say. With action. Patricia from Dr. Reyes's office called at 8:15 to tell me that a nonprofit called the Bridges Medical Foundation had an emergency grant application that Jennifer had already partially filled out on my behalf and needed my signature by noon. A prosecutor named Daniel Whitfield from the county DA's office left a voicemail at 9 asking me to call him back before 10. And at 9:40, a woman named Claire Oberg from the Columbus Dispatch called and introduced herself as a features reporter who covered financial crimes and healthcare funding stories. And she asked me, in a voice that was somehow both gentle and precise, if I was willing to talk on the record. I called Daniel Whitfield first. He was younger than I expected. He sounded maybe 35, quick and direct, the kind of person who had already read everything before he picked up the phone. "Detective Holt briefed me last night," he said. "I've spoken with Gary Fenton this morning. I've pulled the property records on the Crescent Drive address, and I want to tell you where we are." He paused. "What your mother-in-law did constitutes theft by deception under Ohio Revised Code Section 2913.02. The fraudulent bill of sale is a separate offense, forgery, potentially uttering. Combined value of the stolen property puts this at a 4th-degree felony minimum, possibly 3rd degree, given the circumstances involving a minor's medical care. We can move on this." "She leaves for Turkey tomorrow," I said. "I know. That's why I'm calling you at 9:15 in the morning." Another pause, shorter. "Here's what I need from you. I need you in my office at 11 with every piece of documentation you have. I need Gary Fenton's signed statement, which he's agreed to provide. I need your landlord's written account. And I need you to be prepared to give a formal victim statement today, not next week." I'll be there at 10:50, I said. I called Claire Oberg back second and told her everything. She listened the way Jennifer had listened, completely, without filling the silences. And when I finished, she said, "Can I quote you by name?" "Yes," I said. "Is there anyone else I should talk to? Anyone who knew about the harvest plan, the money, Mason's treatment?" I thought for a moment. "Gary Fenton," I said. "And a woman named Jennifer Cole. She's a patient advocate at Columbus Children's. She's the one who connected all of this." "I'll reach out to them today," Claire said. "Ashley, this story is going to run. I want you to be prepared for what that means. It's going to be visible. People are going to have opinions. Some of them will be ugly." "My son is in the pediatric ICU with pneumonia and a bone marrow disorder," I said. "I'm past worrying about opinions." She was quiet for a beat. "I'll have something filed by this evening." I went to Daniel Whitfield's office at 10:50 with a folder containing every text message screenshot I'd printed, the notes I'd made on my legal pad the morning after the fields were stripped, and a handwritten timeline I'd put together during the previous 48 hours. Gary Fenton's signed statement was already on Whitfield's desk when I arrived. Mr. Patterson's written account was emailed in while I was sitting in the chair across from the prosecutor's desk. Whitfield read through everything methodically, and when he looked up, he had the expression of a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected. "The text message where she asks about peak harvest timing," he said. "That's premeditation. That's her establishing the window before the act." He set it down. "We're filing today. I'm going to request a flight hold through the U.S. Marshals. It won't prevent her from boarding if she gets to the airport before we execute, but if she's stopped at customs on the way back into the country, there will be a warrant waiting." "What about stopping her before she leaves?" I said. "That's the harder piece," he said honestly. "We can issue, but serving before tomorrow morning is going to depend on timing and resources I don't fully control. What I can tell you is that we are moving as fast as this office has ever moved on a property crime." He looked at me directly. "Because of the child. Because of what she said to you about Mason. That statement, that kid's not going to make it anyway, that's going in the victim impact portion of everything we file. I want that on record." I drove back to the hospital. Mason had had a slightly better night. His temperature was down a degree, and he'd eaten half a cup of applesauce at breakfast, which the nurses had apparently treated as a minor celebration. I sat with him for 2 hours, helping him with a word search book he'd been working on since before the hospitalization, the kind where the words are hidden in a grid and you circle them in colored pencil. He had a whole system: red for animals, blue for food, green for everything else. "Mom," he said at one point, without looking up from the grid, "is Grandma Linda coming to visit?" I kept my face completely neutral. "Not right now, bud." "That's okay," he said, and went back to the word search. "She makes the room feel weird anyway." Out of the mouths of 8-year-olds. Derek came by the hospital at noon. He'd clearly not slept. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago, and he'd worn the same gray shirt 2 days in a row, which, for Derek, was practically a distress signal. He sat next to Mason's bed for a while and helped with the word search, and when Mason dozed off, he came to find me in the hallway. "I called her this morning," he said. "Told her she needs to return the money before she gets on that plane." "What did she say?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "She said she'd pay it back when she got home, that she'd work out a payment plan, that we were overreacting." He looked at the floor. She also said that if we involved the police, she'd tell them that you had agreed to let her handle the harvest sale, that she had your verbal permission. I stared at him. I never said any such thing. I know that, he said quietly. Derek. I waited until he looked at me. The DA's office filed charges this morning. Gary Fenton gave a statement. Mr. Patterson gave a statement. They have my text messages. There is a warrant being processed. I held his gaze. This is not something she can talk her way out of. And I need to know, right now, standing here, that you understand what she did and that you're not going to try to stop this. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I felt my chest tighten. Long enough that I started to understand that this was the moment. Not the stripped fields, not the smirk in the living room, not even the words about Mason. This was the actual moment, right here in the hallway of Columbus Children's Hospital, where Derek Marsh decided who he was. I talked to a divorce attorney this morning, he said, before I came here. I didn't say anything. I'm not saying that's what I want, he said. I'm saying I talked to someone, because I needed to understand what I was doing when I gave her that information in July, what I was responsible for. He looked up. She manipulated me. I know that. But I made it easy for her. I handed her everything she needed, and I didn't ask the right questions. And I'm going to have to live with that. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. But I'm not protecting her. Not anymore. If anyone calls me, I'll tell them everything I know. I nodded once. That was all I had in me right then. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't absolution, and it wasn't the end of the conversation, not by a long way. But it was enough to work with for today. Claire Oberg's article ran online at 6:17 p.m. I know because Jennifer Cole texted me the link with a single line. It's up. It's good. Brace yourself. The headline read, Ohio mother says $15,000 crop sale meant for son's bone marrow transplant was stolen by grandmother. Now the grandmother is boarding a plane to Turkey. By midnight, it had been shared 43,000 times. By the time Linda's flight landed in Istanbul at approximately 11 a.m. local time the following day, the Bridges Medical Foundation had received so many calls and emails referencing Mason's case that Jennifer called me personally to say they were fast-tracking the emergency grant. A church in Grover Falls, one I'd never attended, had started a fundraiser that raised $6,000 in 18 hours. The farmers market coordinator, a woman named Brenda, had organized a community sale for the following weekend with all proceeds going to Mason's recovery fund. My phone had so many unread messages that I eventually turned off notifications and just let it go. And then, 2 days after Linda landed in Istanbul, at 2:47 in the morning, the international number lit up my screen. +90. Turkey. I let it ring 4 times. 5. My thumb hovered. I answered. The voice on the other end was not Linda's. It was a man, younger, panicked, speaking accented English with effort. Please, is this Ashley? Ashley Marsh? This is the consulate duty officer. We have a situation. I'm listening, I said. What had happened, as I pieced together over the next 30 minutes of fragmented phone calls and one very long conversation with a genuinely shaken U.S. Embassy duty officer, was this. Linda and her friend from the HOA, a woman named Patricia Gould, who apparently had no idea what Linda had done, had been detained at a hotel in Istanbul. The Turkish authorities had received a notification through Interpol's financial crimes channel flagging Linda's passport in connection with active fraud charges filed in Ohio. The notification had triggered a routine detention pending verification with U.S. authorities. Linda had not taken this well. According to the duty officer, she had told the Turkish police that the charges were fabricated, that her daughter-in-law was mentally unstable, that there had been a miscommunication about some garden produce, and that she had the legal right to sell anything on a property she had co-signed. The Turkish police had been unimpressed. The charges were not, as Linda apparently hadn't fully grasped yet, a family disagreement. They were felony fraud charges filed by a county prosecutor with 3 corroborating witnesses and documentary evidence. The call that came through to me was technically a courtesy notification, the consulate informing a family member of a U.S. citizen's detention. They were not asking me to help. They were not asking me to intervene. But Linda had, apparently, in a moment of either desperation or strategic miscalculation, told the consulate officer to call her daughter-in-law directly, to tell me to make it stop. The duty officer, to his credit, said this carefully. Ms. Marsh, I'm conveying this as requested. I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for any particular action on your part. The matter is proceeding through proper legal channels regardless. I understand, I said. Tell her I hope she enjoys Istanbul, and tell her that Mason's surgery is scheduled. There was a small silence. I'll pass that along, he said. I hung up and sat in the orange-beige waiting room chair, the same one I'd been in when Jennifer Cole sat down next to me, and I looked at the door to the pediatric ICU, and I breathed. Linda was detained in Turkey for 11 days. When she was released and her passport was flagged for return, she was met at Cincinnati/Northern Kentucky Airport by Detective Holt and a deputy U.S. Marshal. She was processed, arraigned, and released on bail pending trial. The charges were theft by deception and forgery, both felonies. Her attorney, she hired a private one, expensive, from Columbus, argued that she had believed she had the legal right to the harvest. Whitfield's office countered with the text messages, the fabricated bill of sale, and Gary Fenton's testimony about how thoroughly Linda had constructed the transaction. The case did not go to trial. 8 months later, Linda Marsh pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft by deception, paid full restitution of $14,200, received 3 years of probation, and was ordered to have no contact with me or Mason. She did not attend the sentencing. Her attorney submitted a written statement on her behalf. I was told it did not include an apology. Derek and I did not stay married. That conversation in the hospital hallway was the beginning of an ending that had probably been coming for longer than either of us had admitted. We separated 4 months after Mason's transplant, filed 6 months after that, and finalized the divorce the following spring. It was painful in the specific, grinding way that the end of a mostly good thing is painful. Not dramatic, not full of shouting, just the slow understanding that trust, once it has a certain kind of hole in it, doesn't always heal back to load-bearing. Derek is a good father. He is present and consistent, and he still coaches Little League. We are careful with each other in the way of people who shared something real and then couldn't hold it together. And I think that's probably the best version of what we could be now. Mason had his bone marrow transplant on a Thursday morning in October. Dr. Reyes led the team. I sat in a waiting room, a different one, smaller, with blue chairs, for 6 hours. And at the end of those 6 hours, Dr. Reyes came through the door with her quiet voice and her careful face and told me that the procedure had gone well, that his body was responding, that the next 90 days would tell us more, but that she was cautiously, genuinely optimistic. He was 9 years old, and he had been through more than most adults I know. And when I was finally allowed into his room, and he looked up at me from the pillow with Derek's dark eyes and said, "Mom, did it work?" I told him the truth. "It's working," I said. "It's working right now." He is 11 now. He plays Little League in the spring, and he still follows me around the garden asking questions about whether earthworms have feelings. Last September, we harvested the new sweet corn, 2 full acres, the rows I replanted the spring after everything happened. And I let him help me load the crates into the truck for the farmer's market. He hefted a crate that was almost as big as he was, and looked at me with this expression that was half pride and half pure stubbornness, his chin set exactly the way mine gets when I'm not backing down from something. "This is ours," he said. "Yes," I said. "It is." There are things I know now that I didn't know then. I know that a person can smile at you from across a kitchen window and already be calculating your destruction. I know that love and loyalty are not the same thing, and that the people closest to you can hand a weapon to someone else without ever picking it up themselves. I know that a stranger in a hospital waiting room with a notebook and a direct gaze can change the entire shape of what happens next. And I know that fury, the cold, clarifying kind, is not a thing to be afraid of. It is a tool. It is, sometimes, the only tool that works. But mostly what I know is this. Linda Marsh looked at a sick child and said he wasn't going to make it anyway. She said it to his mother's face, without flinching, in the armchair she always sat in, with her hands folded in her lap. She was wrong. He made it. And she's the one who didn't.